Hello students, let's take up the last part of the State Directorate. Rather we say the relationship between the State Secretariat and the State Directorate. As you know, the Secretariat department is different from the Executive department or the Directorate department, but they are related to each other in certain pattern of relationship. The pattern of relationship is described under three approaches, which are the status quo approach, the bridging the gulf approach, and de-amalgamation approach. The first approach, that is the status quo approach, emphasizes that the role of Secretariat and the Directorate are well defined or have distinct functional domain. It is on the pattern of the distinction between staff and line agencies, which means Secretariat performs the role of staff agency and the Directorate look after the means to undertake the role of line agency. In other words, we can say that the Directorate acts as the line agency, or this approach also advocates the policy administration dichotomy. Again, I am emphasizing this aspect that it advocates the policy administration dichotomy, that is the traditional division between the policy and administration. The advantages and disadvantages of this approach or this pattern of relationship are debatable, which means there are advantages as well as disadvantages of having this kind of relationship between these two entities. If utilized in a balanced manner or in a rational manner, then we can have the advantages of separating the policy and administration, but it is not always feasible. Now let us take up the next approach, the second approach, that is the bridging the gulf approach. It suggests, number one, to confer an ex officio secretariat status to the heads of the executive department, or number two, to establish a system under which a secretary concurrently holds the office of head of the executive department, or number three, to merge or amalgamate executive department under a corresponding secretariat department, or a variant of it, means variant of the third options. This is again, all the three options have their own advantages and disadvantages. We are not taking those here, as it is outside the scope of present study or present learning system. If you want to learn about it, then I am providing an additional reading for that purpose. Go to the additional reading and you will be able to understand it. The third approach, that is the de-amalgamation approach, has arisen consequent to the implementations of amalgamation approach, as that brought both positive and negative impact in the working of the state administration. The approach involves separation of unified system and return to traditional split system of policy administration dichotomy. The process emphasizes the need to confine the head of the executive department to field work alone, and separation of cadres of Secretariat and Directorate, means their officials will not be interchangeable. The discussion on the role of the Secretariat and the Directorate lead to conclude, after a discussion in brief about the pattern of relationship between the State Secretariat and State Directorate, let us have other aspects which reflects the relationship between these two important institutions or organizations of the state administration. Let us start with, first of all, the role of the Secretariat and the Directorate leads to conclude us that the Secretariat aids, assists and advises the political executive in taking policy decisions, and the executive department or the director implement those policy decisions of political executive. It means that they have the distinct role. One is policy formulation, that is with the Secretariat, and the second is policy implementation, that is with the Directorate. Number 2, it is also worth to state that a Secretariat department deals with more than one department and maybe up to 7, depending upon the political conditions in that particular state. Whereas the Secretariat department, like the Department of Law, Department of Finance, etc., do not have any attached executive department, as the role of these departments is purely either advisory or keeping administrative control over certain public agency or agencies. In other words, some of the Secretariat department in the state Secretariat may not have corresponding executive department at the state Directorate level. Number 3, the Secretariat department is normally headed by a generalist officer, IAS, but it may not be always true regarding executive department, as stated earlier also. Even if a specialist is heading an executive department, its head functions under the supervision of generalist officer. For example, the Department of Agriculture, Home, Education, Health, Industry, Social Welfare are of this category of arrangement. Number 4, the Secretariat is concerned with policy formulation and the Directorate is concerned with policy execution, as stated so many times in this discussion. The two processes are not discrete, but rather the continuous with each other. It is true that conceptually these two may be considered distinct ones, but in practice it is highly difficult to draw a boundary line between them, that is, the processes of policy formulation and policy implementations. In other words, at practical plane, these two processes are inextricably interlinked and cannot be separated from each other. The second Administrative Reforms Commission observed that policy formulation functions need to be distinguished from those relating to the policy implementation. The Commission noted that the need to provide the ministers with high quality policy advice requires that secretaries to government and their supporting staff in the Secretariat with policy advisory responsibilities do not get diverted by the demands of managing routine administrative and operational responsibilities. This would call for a broad separation of policy formulation and implementation responsibilities. The Commission is of the view that certain principles need to be followed to stipulate that ministries should concentrate on the following: number 1, policy making and strategic decisions; number 2, budgeting; number 3, monitoring of implementation; number 4, appointment of key personnel. Number 5, coordination. Number 6, evaluation. It also emphasized that attached and subordinate offices would serve as the executive agencies of the ministries, Directorate in case of state, and concentrate on the implementation of government policies and programs. The political head of the department is minister, who is accountable to the legislature for policy and performance of his department. The administrative head of a department is the secretary, who assists the minister in policy formulation and administration. The third component is head of the executive department, who is responsible for implementing the policies and programs of the government. The existing system of relationship between State Secretariat and Executive Department is criticized, especially on the following grounds. Number 1, the Secretariat organization approaches in the functions of the Executive Department. It has considerably weakened the authority of the Executive Department. Number 2, there is inadequate delegations of work and the authority and control exercised by the Secretariat results in unnecessary delay in execution of policies and programs by the departments, as they are compelled to seek constant approval and consultation from the State Secretariat. Number 3, as the generalist officers are appointed as secretary and he or she is authorized to examine the proposal and scheme prepared by specialists, officer of the attached offices or the directorate offices. Being layman, the journalist officer cannot understand the technical aspects of the schemes, proposals submitted to them. Consequently, he is unable to contribute anything substantive to such proposals or schemes. Number 4, unnecessary scrutiny of the proposals submitted by the departments to the Secretariat results in unnecessary duplication and delay. The proposals in the Secretariat are submitted after detailed scrutiny in the attached offices or in the executive departments, in the attached offices or in the directorates. The second Administrative Reform Commission in its 15th report made following recommendations for ensuring smooth relationship between two uppermost echelons of state governments, that is State Secretariat and State Directorate. Number 1, the state governments should scrutinize the functions or activities of each department to confirm whether these activities or functions are critical to the mission of the department and can only be carried out by the governmental agency. Number 2, only those functions or activities that have to be carried out by the government based on the principles stated earlier should be carried out directly by the departments. Other functions or activities should be carried out by the executive agencies of the department. Number 3, each executive agency, whether a new body or an existing departmental undertaking or agency or board or special purpose body, etc., that is converted into an executive agency must be semi-autonomous and professionally managed under a mandate. Such executive agency should be structured as a department, board, commission, company, society, etc. Number 4, there is a need for right balance between autonomy and accountability. While designing the institutional framework of executive agencies, this could be achieved through well-designed performance agreements, memorandum of understanding, contracts, etc. However, preparing and enforcing such performance contracts require considerable upgradation of capacity in the concerned governmental departments. Number 5, agencies dealing with subjects where major functions and activities have devolved on local governments would need to concentrate on monitoring and supervision, ensuring of standards and quality, providing guidance to local governments on technical matters, training of personnel, giving feedback to the government on implementation, and performance and advising on changes that are needed in plans and programs. So, these are the different recommendations of the Second Administrative Reform Commission to ensure a smooth relationship between the State Secretariat and the executive departments of the state. It will ensure a smooth functioning of the state administration. Now, let us sum up about the talks. The ministers and the Secretariat departments are responsible for taking policy decisions in a state. The responsibility to implement policies and programs designed to achieve objectives set forth in such policies is entrusted or assigned to the executive department or the executive agencies. It is true that there should be a distinction between the process of policy. There should be a distinction between the process of policy formulation and policy implementation, and the entities undertaking the concerned activities respectively. But it is also equally true that making distinction between policy formulation and policy implementation at practical level found to be impractical. Therefore, a rational system of relationship between Secretariat departments and executive departments need to be evolved, and the recommendation made by the Second Administrative Reform Commissions must be followed. Thank you very much. I hope by these two talks you have been able to understand what is the State Directorate, what are its functions, why it has been established, what kind of the relationship is there in between the State Secretariat and the State Directorate. So, thank you very much.